Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job. Hello, and welcome back to Homeschool Together, your number one summer reading podcast on the planet. A little bit of the title there and the intro. If you have a chance and you want to support the podcast all the way through the summer, you know it's hot out, you're sweating, you smell like sunscreen. It hasn't changed for days. You're thinking, how can I support this podcast? You can go over there and check out our Gumroad page and look and see if there's any user guides or resources that might be interesting to you. You can go ahead and pick those up.
Or just any of our links to Amazon if you want to go ahead and get that second swimsuit for your kids like I did this week, or that extra pool floaty. Just go ahead and click any of the links to any of the books or things we recommend, and then we get a couple bucks. It helps to keep the podcast going.
Or the Barbie boat that actually floats.
Yeah, the one that actually floats, not the bigger one that does not float at all. Poor engineering. As you're shopping for your curriculum, we're all getting kind of geared up. This is a time when we do a lot of looking. We're going to be getting back to our curriculum reviews, so please stay with us. We just had a little hiatus while we traveled, and Matt finished his master's degree, and so we took off for a little bit, but we're going to be getting back to reviews, so definitely look out on our YouTube for that, and check out on our website at homeschool-together.com. If you have any curriculum you need to purchase, we have lots of reviews and links and summaries there of your different secular options. So go there and check it on out.
Yeah, and our Science of Summer is going to be starting here pretty soon. We already, I think, vlogged a few videos that are going to be...
Yep, we're in the middle of it now.
Yeah, we're going to stack out a few here over the next couple of weeks. Ariel, we're going to be doing a little bit of a series, as we always do.
I like series. If y'all don't like series, let us know, because I kind of think it's cool to just kind of get into something. It's almost like a multi-week audiobook. Where it's like, and we pick up where we left off. We're going to, sometimes these topics would be like, oh, this would be a 3-hour podcast. Let's just break it up and do a series. So This one, we wanted to talk about reading comprehension, because we've done a lot of stuff about learning to read, and that's where we have been for most of our, younger children. And now that our older daughter is reading well, now it's kind of the next question. It's like, how do we turn this into something? And we've heard about reading comprehension. And when I started the research for this series, I had a very vanilla base level understanding of what it really is. And I was really surprised at how much goes into reading comprehension. So today we want to start our series by kind of like reading comprehension 101.
Yeah, I think for most of us, we think reading comprehension is kind of that, like, did they actually read it?
Yeah.
Get it?
It's the test of, did they not just look at the pictures?
Yeah, but it's a little bit more about beyond just understanding it. Can they interpret what is happening? That's kind of like the depth, the meaning. Are they kind of like are they going to be able to use what they read? Right. A lot of times we are asked questions. I do this in our workbooks. I see this in our workbooks. They ask you a question, not just about the text and you kind of regurgitate an answer, but they want you to take what you've learned from the text and can you then synthesize some new piece of information or answer a parallel question or a perpendicular question about the text that you read. And that requires you to comprehend it, understand it, and be able to synthesize that information into something new. I think that's kind of an aspect that we kind of like, we don't think about when we think about reading comprehension, and also being able to predict what is coming, because if you can understand what you're reading and you synthesize and you really deeply understand what's going on, you may be able to make inferences or predictions on what's going to happen. We always see that in a movie, like, oh, can you figure out the ending? Or if you're reading a chapter in a book, can they figure out, well, who is the bad guy, who is the good guy? Really, contending with the text and looking for that, the mystery between the words, I think is something that we need to begin to teach our children and kind of see through that.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of just initially thought of it as like, my check that she was really reading and that she was retaining any of it, right? Because it's such a big hurdle to get your child to that point where they can read and that they start to read for some amount of fun. And so I feel like we struggle up this mountain and we feel like we're at the top. We made it all this way. They can read. Huzzah, And then you kind of realize you're like, oh, wait, no. This was just like base camp. Now we have to go the rest of the way up the mountain, right? And so I think that this is great because we're going to talk about like the foundation. So, we're going to zoom out today and talk about the basics, and then we're going to zoom in some future episodes. So to start kind of our 50,000 foot level, what is reading comprehension really?
Well, it's at its core, it's making meaning from the text, but meaning isn't just like understanding, as we kind of just said, what was written, but how it was written, why it was written. You kind of see the guts of that if you ever remember like a kind of a Cliff Notes book, where they give you a summary of what's happened, but also the synopsis. Like we want to know what the writer was trying to convey in this. Even if it's a simple story like something from one of our readers in our curriculums, and it's a short story, there's meaning in there as well. Like, why did the dog do that thing?
Yeah, character motivations.
Character motivations. Was that a good decision or bad decision? Are they good? Did they make a good moral decision or not a good moral decision? Even on the simplest stuff, we've seen this with some of the readers that we've been given within our curriculums that we've recommended in the past, like the Keela and
Molly and Keela.
Molly and Keela is kind of like a morals centered storyline where each story kind of had like a moral quandary within the problem. It's not just saying, oh, did they do the right thing, but like trying to analyze characters' motivations, decision making, kind of a meta view of what the story is about, is kind of those skills that we want to try and to implant just beyond reading the text for plot.
Right. I mean, when you think about it kind of basically, like let's say you're reading something like Charlotte's Web, right? So your child initially might say like, Wilbur was sad, right? That's kind of the basics, right? The 5-year-old would be like, Wilbur is sad. But the real reading comprehension would be understanding like, why is he lonely? Why is he scared? Why doesn't he understand what's going on? And so it's not just, it's not just the outward, he's sad. It's kind of going deeper into the text, which I think is very interesting. We as adults kind of do that. I often think like when we read, at least when I read, especially fiction, it's almost like it's a movie, right? Like I'm watching it, like I'm seeing the expression on the characters' faces and things. And I think initially when our kids are reading, they're sticking with just the words on the page, right? And especially, I think
especially when they're reading,
right?
They're very deep on just the word. I gotta sound this word
exactly. We had this problem when our daughter was learning to read, that she would read. She was so focused on getting every word that she'd finish the sentence and she would have no idea what the sentence actually said. So now we're at the point where she knows what the sentence says, but I think reading is still new enough that she's not going like kind of deeper into. She understands the words on the page, but I almost want to liken it a little bit to learning a foreign language. Okay, kind of she knows the words, she knows what the words mean, but it is difficult. So she's not having time to really like look beyond or look into the depth.
I think that kind of goes back, kind of carrying that forward, that reading comprehension isn't really like a box to check. We have to just do this thing. I think the thing that we realize as home educators is that reading comprehension kind of touches everywhere.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many workbooks I have now. My daughter would say too many.
Maybe
we're whittling them down. But like how many workbooks or activities, once they get beyond kind of that first, second grade level, is almost universally reading comprehension. Like what is this like our little science workbooks that we're doing? It's a block of text. And then there's multiple choice questions that she has to answer about those and write a sentence about that thing. I mean, it's about science, but it's like, this is really just a reading exercise, right? And sometimes, you draw pictures and maybe do a little of a science experiment, but there's like a lot of reading in there. And then when we do like maybe like a social studies workbook, we're doing kind of like history or government stuff. Again, it's like a lot of reading comprehension. Like what did this text mean? You start to think about like poems that you're reading. And if you start to like dive into poems as something that you're reading, there's a lot of symbolism and hidden meaning and metaphors. And these things are more abstract concepts. So like
Yeah.
not only do you need to be able to read it, but you also need to read the layers. Like the language has kind of like multiple layers, like an onion, right? And you've got to peel it like
Ogres are like onions.
Ogres are like onions. What was the response? Like, what, you're smelly or something?
They're layers.
They're layers. And like doing that is a very complex thing. And,
Yeah.
and to be able to do that, in flow while they're reading is difficult. Even when you come back to reread or reflect on what you're reading, that can be difficult. So like,
I think that's what gives
Yeah.
reading though its full depth, right? That's where
it's the omni skill.
that's where like the power is of the whole experience. It's why I think it's so hard for a movie to ever capture a book, because there's so much happening in every word you're reading,
Mm-hmm.
all the things you're thinking and the motivations behind and what they're thinking and feeling, and you're all in it. I think it's very different.
Well, and even more so, like understanding what you're reading can give you context. We have a good example here with like Harriet Tubman. If you're reading a story about her, you may not, a young student who maybe has like a paragraph to read about her, unless you understand the context and the time, it can be very difficult to understand that. So, reading for comprehension can involve, implanting, knowledge and memory that you can then recall coming forward. And oh, that was said in this time period with Civil War, with racism and slavery and all that stuff. This character was said in that time frame. I now have a larger context of that window, even though it's just a small one paragraph text about, doing something or whatever it might be. That reading comprehension can inform in other subjects. You do a little bit of history here, but you then may read something for, your government class or your social studies workbook or something like that. And they have cross applicability there.
Right. You're talking about that cause and effect, right? And taking something that from another place and overlaying it with what you're reading. And I think it's a really difficult skill, because you're reading the actual words, but you're overlaying these other thoughts on top that about the time and the place and all of that. It's interesting too, we're talking about going across subjects, because reading comprehension, think about science, right? You're going to read a science experiment or a lab procedure or the process of how something works, right?
It matters. Like one word could mean like the inverse of what if you leave the not, do not do this, and then you read it as do this.
Right. Yeah. There could be huge problems. Also, if you're trying to understand scientific processes, right? So you're reading something and you're thinking about every step that it is in the real world. We read with our daughters just a couple weeks ago about the water cycle, for example. And, they're hearing the words. They need to be able to, in their mind, go, that's this physical action that's happening, right? So science is a big part of it. Obviously, reading comprehension with math, right? The word problems will never end. They go on forever.
No, and you can see them come up, and you just, I know across the board, even my experience when I was younger, I'm pretty good at math, but just like seeing the word problems, you're just like, there's just like this big deflating, feeling, and it's difficult.
Because all of a sudden it's multi-layered. It's not just numbers and
words
operators.
The words have meaning, and you got to interpret those words based on, the knowledge it can be very challenging.
And a lot of times as those get higher level word problems, in high school and college, then they're tricksy word problems, because they're going to include extraneous information that you don't need to solve it. And you need to figure out what you need and what you don't need out of that word problem. So then your reading comprehension is even more important for math.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, I don't know. We know it pops up everywhere, right? We know this, reading comprehension comes everywhere, but there can very often be some misconceptions that kind of come with that. I think one of the first ones is you're watching your reader, they're reading fluently. Fluency means, correctness with speed. Like it has to include both of those. And I think that's the proper definition, if I can remember it off the top of my head here. It's reading, accuracy plus speed is fluency. And if we think, oh, they're fluent, they're reading the text, they should understand what they're reading. And that's not always the case. Yeah. You're going to have readers. It's a separate skill that emerges from the kind of the base skills that you're doing. We read aloud, we have phonemic awareness. They're now starting to do phonics and grapheme awareness. They're now reading and parsing and, putting words together. They're now reading at speed. They're doing sight words. They're speeding it up. Like we've crossed the chasm between sounding out words, and now we're starting to sight read for speed. Are they getting what they're reading? Do they understand the words? I think a lot of times, as educators, we will think that they're reading correctly. One of the big problems with reading comprehension is, do our students understand the definitions of those words? Do they understand the vocabulary behind those words? Even if they read it, do they know what that word means? And that's a lot of times kids will be reading a text. You'll ask them a question. They won't be able to answer a question about it, even though they did really well reading it. They may not understand the base understanding of those words. Even shorter words, they may not understand the context of those. We have words that are used in multiple places, right and right. Do they understand the context of that? But even just there may be a word they've never heard before that they read, and then our daughter will do it. She'll just plow right through the word.
Right.
And I'll go, do you know what that word means? No, I have no idea what that means.
Right. They could decode it correctly and have no idea what it is.
Absolutely. And that's one of the kind of the reading tests that teachers and school districts will do for students on reading comprehension, is they'll pin down that they don't understand the vocabulary, the definitions of the words, and that it has to go back to the teacher has to teach that prior vocabulary. There's a whole theory about teaching children words that they know may be a little bit challenging, or maybe a little bit, they call them like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 words. Once you get into those tier 2 words, it's a probability of the students not understanding what that word means increases. And so a lot of times prior to text reading, they will then do a little bit of vocabulary. So they will introduce words that may be new and unique. You'll see this in reading curriculums too, when you are getting into like a new short story after you've learned some type of, some phonics, maybe some new phoneme for you, like an IGH or something like that, or whatever. They will teach you some new words ahead of time. And you'll have to do some definitions. Do you know what this means? Do you understand this word? Let's read this word. And they will ask you to, define that word for the student, because when it is then used in context in the short story, if they don't have an understanding of what that word means, they will be lost in the comprehension element, even though they may be reading at speed, they'd be fluent and accurate and do all the things, but they may not understand the back definition of the words.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Whenever there's a larger word, and it's funny, sometimes I'll ask our daughter, hey, do you know what that means? And she'll go, yeah. I'll be like, you tell me what it means. Because I'm just skeptical. And, hey, look, half the time she's right, but the rest of the time she's just like heard it in a show. This is especially true, like they'll watch a show on Netflix or Disney Plus or something. They've heard the word used. They've heard it used in context. They sort of know what it means, right? They're kind of in the ballpark, but they don't really get it. And so, even if your child says they know what it is, I think just kind of some light questioning is really good. Another misconception about reading comprehension is that this is exclusively like an ELA thing. Like it only matters for stories. It only matters if you're reading fiction, which is not accurate, right? They need to be, we talked about reading lab instructions and stuff. They need to be able to, read and interpret a science diagram and understand the labels. And, so it's just as important in nonfiction and practical things that they're going to have to do. It's not just about reading a story and getting all of the ethical themes and all of those pieces. That is obviously an important skill, but it's just as important for nonfiction reading.
I think it comes in really noticeable when you get into those upper tier words that are a lot more difficult, or they are specific to that genre of, or not genre, but in that subject field. Science, I think, is a great example of that. You'll end up having these scientific terms that the student may have never encountered.
Those are tier 3 words, right?
Those are those big tier 3 words. Like our younger students, maybe like first, second, third grade, maybe not run into those as much. But if you're starting to think about like middle to upper elementary, they're going to start to see words, especially doing things like the water cycle you kind of brought up earlier, words like condensation, right? Or condense. In the clouds. I mean, that may not be a word that they understand. They may think of it in terms of condensing something that's smaller, or maybe they have some, they may understand that like certain structures of the words, like a prefix or a suffix mean something. but they may not be able to put it all together.
Yeah.
Kind of the morphology of the word, but they may not understand the complete word. So like these tier 3 words may be a challenge for them, and that's, I think, kind of what you're saying is once they get into these other subjects, they're going to be exposed to words that they may not regularly see.
So we said tier 3 a couple of times here. Would you just take like a 2-second detour and give the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 definition so people know what we're kind of talking about? So
tier 1s are like very common words that you see all the time. Can, do, that. Those are words that often are very easily decodable. Tier 2 words are a little bit more challenging. They may include phonemes that are a little bit more advanced, especially like our All About Reading, where we're in like level 3 now, and we're still introducing new phonemes. And so these are phonemes that are more abstract. Like I use the IGH example. That is something that maybe like a little bit older student would experience. So if you have like a younger student who's like in 1st and 2nd grade, they may not see those phonemes, so they may struggle with those words. Those are more rare words. Tier 3 are more specific to a certain subject or a certain field, that within that field they will use them. They may be ubiquitously used, but are not commonly seen in written text.
Okay.
Like science is a good example.
Yeah, all your scientific terms.
Even like things like if you start studying a little bit of like government related topics, constitution, big words like that they probably wouldn't see otherwise, but are specific to that subject or that field or that topic, that tend to be longer, larger words that are more rarely used. That's kind of a tier 3.
Your dinosaur names.
Big dinosaur names are probably it's those magical tier 4 words that they haven't classified as the words used once ever.
So the last thing we wanted to talk about as a misconception about reading comprehension is that kids will figure it out eventually. Like, if they just read enough, they will just eventually figure it out. And so
it's true to some
extent. So the research that I did talked about, there's kind of 3 camps, right? Some kids are going to they're just going to figure it out. It's going to click. Some kids, that's going to come much, much later. Yeah. And other kids, you could definitely help it come sooner if you would just employ some active modeling of reading comprehension and some of the strategies, 100%. Which is the stuff that we're going to talk about in the rest of the series. We're going to go into depth about how we can help our kids build their reading comprehension muscles. Mm-hmm. And so, the idea that eventually it'll come. It'll just come together. Not necessarily for all kids. So,
well, and I think the biggest thing that we have to realize is that comprehension, as with almost any skill, can be taught through explicit, systematic instruction. The kind of the science of reading folks, the Orton Gilliam method that we use with All About Reading, strict, explicit, systematic instruction, where the educator you are showing them, and kind of what you said there was really good, where you are modeling behavior, you're modeling the learning, but also you're explicitly telling them, this is how you pronounce this phoneme. Right. This is how we read. Showing prosody as well, the emotion of the reading, mm-hmm. when you're reading, Harry Potter to our daughter tonight.
With all the voices. And accents.
When you're doing that type of acting, it's showing the reader how to read the story, how the pacing occurs as well, so that they can intuitively understand mm-hmm. that there's a pacing in the reading. I have to pause at the comma. They won't know that unless you show them how to do that.
Right.
And a lot of these things have to be taught explicitly, like where you are telling them exactly how to do it. It is proven to be the best way to go. So yeah, what's great about this is we do have some learners that can just go out there and they're rock stars and they just hit it hard and they're awesome. Mm-hmm. There are other students who struggle at this, and then sometimes there's students who will fake it, and you don't know that the problem is there. And so that's where that one-on-one questioning, so you can kind of tease out where the errors are so that you can then focus your efforts, whether if it's vocabulary problem, great. I can do that. I can teach you the definitions of these words. If it is a contextual problem, if it's a fluency problem, if it's an accuracy problem, I can go ahead and do that. Maybe we still have some phoneme problems that are causing downstream effects in our reading comprehension. We can go ahead and attack those. So kind of finding which avenue it is.
Yeah.
I had to do this simulated reading test with a student. It wasn't a real student, but it was a fake student who was like probably 35 years old, and they were pretending to be a student. It was very strange.
It's part of his master's,
It was very strange.
for his teaching certificate.
But I actually had to give this reading test, and I had to like ask them to read the words, and I had to indicate if they did it correctly or not. And we were able to root cause where the problem was. And then from there, I was able to then say, okay, we need to work on these phonemes and these sight words, and we are kind of in this area, and here's the, kind of the prescription to go forward. Oh, you're reading well here, but those didn't include any sight words or more challenging words. Those were very decodable words. So you did good there, but once we got into some more challenging phonemes you didn't know, we circled those. Okay, those are phonemes we have to go back and reinforce so we can move forward with our reading comprehension. Being able to root cause from our reading comprehension, there may be holes there. And that doesn't mean you failed as a parent or anything. You're just trying to fill in the holes so that they can go forward and be great. So I agree with you. It's, rest assured this can be taught. It should be taught, and you can help instruct your student and go moving forward.
And it develops over time. So one of the things that we can do just initially, right, is increasing our kids' active literacy. And so it's all the words that they're exposed to every day. And we have every person has their own vocabulary that they use. And, like you use the word ubiquitous. I almost never say that word, right? I maybe read that word sometimes, but that's not usually in my active vocabulary. I don't use it. So one of the things we can do is, kids can often understand at a much higher level than they can read, which is where audiobooks comes in. And that's great because we can immediately add to their, vocabulary that they're exposed to and that active literacy without having to have it as part of our vocabularies ourselves.
Well, it takes a little of that pressure off of us. Now listen, I want to sit down and read War and Peace to your daughter.
No.
You can do that.
It's got to be appropriate. So.
There it is on the shelf right there. No, you want to be able to offload some of that work. You can't sit there and spend 5 hours a day reading to your student. Nobody's doing that. You're right. Using technology in this way to help offload that, but also give them even more time in the spoken word. I think you're absolutely right. Adding those words, because even when they're hearing it, they can, because think about it. A lot of us learn to write well because we listen and we read a lot. And then we kind of, because the AI in our brain gets trained and then we go ahead and regurgitate that, right? It's like a mimicking aspect. Like, I don't know why the grammar is wrong, but I can fix it because I can hear it. I can hear it because I've heard millions and millions and millions of words come through my head. And I've read millions of words, and I just go, oh, yeah, that's got to change here. That there wasn't the right conjunction. It doesn't sound right. How would I make that sound right?
But our kids haven't heard enough to know that it. It's funny. We have our daughter write some, sentences, and she'll read it, and sometimes she doesn't even know that it doesn't sound right.
She is now starting to catch it. She's really
getting
funny.
it.
I look at it and I go, I see the grammar. There's a mistake. She's missing a whole word. I go, read that to me. And she'll, instead of like regurgitating what she had in her head, she'll read what she said and she'll get to the spot and she'll go, oh, I forgot the, and she'll add the.
Yeah.
And I'll be like, yes, like she's starting to get it. When she reads back what she's written, she can hear the mistake and go ahead and fix that. It starts to happen. It's amazing.
But I think that's the power of that oral storytelling, right? It's doing discussions about what we read and doing read alouds, all the read alouds that we do with Build Your Library and all the other, chapter books that we read and stuff. And, that you read to your children there at home, or you listen audiobooks in the car, or whether it's podcasts that you listen to. Our kids love to listen to like Yodo Daily. And and sometimes it's interesting because they're getting things from, like British, vernacular and stuff, which is fun because they're like, what's a boot? They're like, I don't understand why it's in a boot. And we're like, no, not like a shoe, like a car. So, it's fun. It's fun for them to hear different things, but then that's where we can begin to develop their reading comprehension. So we start there, grow stronger as we discuss it, and we ask appropriate questions, and we start to help them to mature into that higher level thinking. So that's kind of what we're going to be discussing in the series, is how we can make all the movements of those steps.
Absolutely. Adding prior knowledge, talking about, what's happened beforehand. A lot of times when we're reading books to our children, in the Around the World journey, we're reminding them, hey, we're in this country.
Remember about this cultural significance.
They have these festivals. This book is talking about those festivals. remember these types of foods that we read about before. Now let's read the new book. Like that's preloading the context
Right.
with our students so that they're in the right mindset, that they can then pull that active recall from what they've done before. And then now you read the story, and that imprints differently than if you didn't start with some prior knowledge. I think it's a very powerful tool that you can absolutely do. And then also kind of like comparing texts, I think is a really big thing, especially if you are reading poems or you're reading similar books about the similar like events. Like sometimes when we're reading stuff, we may have someone famous. This happens a lot in our around the world journey, that some country may be famous for someone. I think there was one that in Kenya, the woman who planted the trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, we ended up reading like
Wangari?
the Mungari, yeah. And then
So?
what happened was that there were like 3 books that we read, and they're all the same. And
The same story.
Same story about the same person, told in different ways and different art styles. But we're able to say, oh, do you remember this? How is this book different than this one? And be able to compare similar texts, I think is a really cool thing. But also, if you're then doing some historical stuff with them, comparing the text, maybe the styles. One could be more like editorialized, where you're like, oh, this is somebody's opinion, or is this a text that is from a primary source or a secondary source? Starting to talk about that. Like, you think that's ELA, but also those are part of the history standards.
Absolutely.
And so they're asking you to compare text, like that's a whole standard for history that they have you do. But we're doing that in our kind of our around the world journey, or you're doing the history thing. So doing those type of skills, again, asks them to call back to the reading comprehension or to their prior knowledge, and allows them to articulate new thoughts and synthesize new ideas. So bringing in that level of maturity there, even with our earlier, learners, in a more focused, environment where you are prompting these questions, you're asking them to do these things, again, teaching them explicitly how to do these things, begins to cultivate those skills.
So if your children are reading well and you're wondering, like, so I'm not sure, like, is this, obviously they're reading okay, they enjoy reading. Is my child struggling with reading comprehension? So there's a couple of main things to kind of think about. Like, does your child summarize accurately, or do they just remember like one cool moment? Like our daughter's at the one cool moment, right? She'll be like, oh yeah, he did this one thing. Like, well, what about the rest of the story? Oh,
can't remember.
Right, because there's like just something that stuck out. So that's one thing to ask yourself. Can your child answer open-ended questions about the text that they read, or do they just kind of freeze up about that, right? I see that with our daughter. I'm like, oh, you just read this story about this. Well, so, what do you think might have happened if this had happened differently? And she's like, you can like hear the crickets. So we're definitely at this stage. Another question, is your child connecting the book to something in their own experience, or are they asking really curious questions? Or are they asking probing deeper questions about it? I know that we sometimes get this. Our daughter's starting to read Babysitter's Club, and she started with the Little Sisters version of Babysitter's Club, the graphic novels. And there's definitely things in there that she was connecting. She was getting ready to rollerblade the other day, and she was like, no, you have to wear all your pads. That's how Karen broke her arm.
That's how Karen broke her arm.
In fact, we were skating with all the Girl Scouts, and she's telling all the Girl Scouts, you need to wear those. That's how Karen broke her arm. She's telling everybody, right? She remembered it.
Yeah.
She made a connection, so it's not like these questions are like all or nothings, right? Sometimes there is something in things that are written about kids and that are contemporary. Maybe they make more connections than something that's written, about an adult, or maybe, some sort of historical document. They're like, what are they connecting to? But they could be asking curious questions, right?
Yeah, and trying to tease out whether or not they are answering or not answering these questions because the material's a little dry.
Yeah.
Versus something interesting. Like, what was the one stories thing that she read?
The Land of Stories.
Land of Stories.
Oh,
like,
she was so into those books.
I'll never
she
forget
listened to the audiobooks.
I'll never forget spending literally 45 minutes as I was working on like one of my papers. One of her classes was canceled, and so she was sitting with me at the table. And she literally talked to me for 45 straight minutes on the first book. And we didn't even finish the plot. And she's like regurgitating the whole plot. I'm like, wow, like you seriously like this story.
Right.
It's crazy. And like, I can't get you to remember like, the reader that we just did, but you remember everything about this story.
I mean, definitely motivation being
sometimes
into
motivation is a big problem, and being able to tell the
Right.
difference between those issues.
But there's also the difference between, so that's an audiobook where
Yeah.
she definitely completely, I mean, she really understood what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have a graphic novel in which not only is she reading it, but she's looking at pictures, right? She's seeing Karen rollerblading. She's seeing her break the arm. So she's reading it as well, but she's also seeing it in the graphics. And then there comes to something where she's just reading the words, and she just recently started a best friends book club with her good friend, and they're reading
It's
this.
very cute.
It's very cute.
I think they're more interested in. She's more interested in the idea of the book club and
You know
the
what?
tea and
They have
and snacks.
tea and they eat like a snack, like each time the other mom and I are each, we're baking things. We baked cookies this week. I think they made scones last week. So the girls read a chapter and then they get together and they talk. And they're reading the Sisters Grimm right now, which they're really enjoying the first book of that.
Mm-hmm.
But when asked about what's happening there, and it's definitely, there's no pictures there. So it's very difficult for her. And then she's having to discuss this with her friend, and her friend's on like the third Harry Potter book, something like that, reading independently. So, I mean, her
friend's
friend,
a little bit more of an advanced reader. Yeah.
yeah, her friend's much more advanced and she reads much faster. So, but they're enjoying doing this together. But I can see the different level of challenge, right? She spent 45 minutes telling you about the audiobook she listened to.
Yeah.
She spent a bunch of time telling all her friends about what happened in the graphic novel she read. Now she's having to sit down and discuss a book without any pictures. And it's a struggle. She's only getting through a couple of pages per reading session, and she has to sit down and do lots of different sessions because she gets burned out easily. So it's definitely building those muscles for her.
Yeah, it's this whole thing with her doing the book club and having to read a little bit. It's a little bit above her. What is she? She's punching up in this respect.
She is.
And it has caused her to have to really work and you're right, train that muscle.
Right.
Do a lot more, writing and reading in sprints. Do 2 or 3 pages here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really, you're right. It's helping. And I mean, we're not able to test if her reading comprehension is correct or not.
But I listened to the discussion her and her BFF there were having, and they were all in sync. They were all talking about the characters and what they're doing.
Yeah.
That's the next question to ask about reading comprehension is, do they understand the character's motivations, or is it just kind of a flat meaning, right? She went here and did this, all just very kind of action driven on the surface. Or is it, she was feeling scared. Mm-hmm. So she went and she made this decision. It was very difficult, like all the rest of it, right? It's all that extra context we talked about, the motivations behind for the character, that depth.
It was kind of funny that happened this morning when she was watching Troll Hunters on Netflix. She loves that show. That's the Guillermo del Toro show, the Arcadia.
You know
Troll
what,
Hunters.
though? She doesn't love anything as much as K-pop Demon Hunters. You guys, tell us if your kids have also watched K-pop Demon Hunters for like the 4th time, because
Holy
our
cow.
Kids are.
It's not just that. It's
wow.
It's the soundtrack too. The little one
with the
is
soundtrack
playing Golden all day long.
She learned to play it on piano. I mean, it's a big thing in our house. Just tell us we're not alone.
Yeah. Please let us know. But she was watching the Troll Hunters thing this morning, and I came down and I'm watching the scene, and it was like, I don't know, deep into the show, and it was doing one of those the music is very emotional. Mm-hmm. It's making tons of cutbacks to previous scenes, and as the character is doing this very important thing, and I'm like, wow, what's happening? She goes, he's becoming a troll. I hate this part. Mm-hmm. And I looked at her and I told her, hey, pause this. And I said, why do you not like it? She goes, because he has to become a troll. I said, yeah. Is he having to make a decision? He's being forced to make a decision. Do I not become a troll? Does that defeat the bad guy? No. Does he have to become a troll to defeat the bad guy? She says, yeah. I said, so he's been put into an impossible decision. And I go, see all these flashbacks? It's making you feel, upset that he has to make this decision. I said, the writer did this not just for the character, but they want you to feel the gravity of the situation. And she was like, I feel it. And I'm like, and so starting to see kind of the writing behind the writing is kind of cool. And I think she's getting a little bit more of that, as we go deeper into this kind of reading comprehension, and she's able to map that across, movies, and you're right, audiobooks that she's reading, and really understanding story and a deeper meaning, I think is a really cool thing.
Well, it makes it so much richer. We keep telling her that reading is so amazing and that it's so enjoyable. But I think when you're only reading on that surface level, like she's not getting into that yet. So that's where, we're hoping, we're going to be covering these couple of areas in our series here, and we're hoping to put some of these different ideas and strategies into practice in our own home. So we'll, get back with you on how that works. But so the first episode we want to talk about asking better questions, right? Helping kids to think deeper about what they've read. So they tell you to ask questions while you read. And I don't know about you, but as a parent reading it, I'm like, what question do I ask? Right? Is it just comprehension questions at the end of the chapter? Where did Despero go? Why did he make that decision?
Why is this girl yelling? What's the word? Gorg or something?
I don't remember.
The girl who lives upstairs, she's the orphan that it helps the princess. She yells the name. Remember. She says the name. Gorg, like that.
I don't know. Right, whatever it is. I'm always just like, what question do I ask? Am I asking, should I ask just about the movements? Should I ask about the motivations, the themes, what they think? That's always a struggle for me. So we're going to talk about helping kids to be able to think deeper.
Absolutely. Then I think we're going to move on to inference and prediction. We talked a little bit about that earlier, being able to understand the text, where it's going, what do you
think is going to happen?
Exactly. And that requires you to, take all the threads that you've been reading and kind of tie your own rope. Being able to answer those type of questions and to think like a writer allows you to see the complexity in the story and, the meaning and character motivations. And I think that's a big piece. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Talking about narration and discussion, we're going to do as well. Kind of strengthening that memory. We really want the kids to remember that. And then how do you process that through conversation? How do I articulate what is happening? How do I narrate back what is going? Being able to use the words that I'm learning, especially if they're new words. How do I do that? And then how do I answer those questions, especially when you start to think about as a parent and as an educator, not just, we're asking them these questions, they're articulating these questions back. What do we want them to actually end up doing? We want them to write that down. And so that's kind of like the next step after here is we're starting to get them to write and to use those skills.
Yep, and we're gonna do an episode about reading to write connections. What using what they've read to inspire, to inform their writing, because that is a big piece. And we're also going to do an episode talking about nonfiction, right, which is helping kids to analyze information critically from nonfiction sources, because that is a different skill than fiction, right? It kind of requires its own lens. So we thought it would be important to talk about nonfiction as well.
It's a challenge for them because they read so many stories, to understand that this is not a story, this is real. But then you have to ask the questions, like kind of critically thinking, what is true and what is not true? Right. Are there issues with, and that can create its own complexities and subtleties and everything. And I'm sure lots of books and podcasts have spilled lots of ink on those subjects, but having our students understand the difference between fiction and nonfiction is super important. Yeah.
We're going to try to make these, not too long, very practical, so you can help coach your kids through becoming better, more thoughtful readers. Just one closing thought I read somewhere, and I thought this was really cool, that reading comprehension is where reading becomes meaningful, not just mechanical. I really liked that. And so I think that's where we're going with this, to make it truly meaningful for our kids. So stay with us, join us on this journey as we go through reading comprehension, and hopefully we'll come out of it on the other end of summer with lots of practical, actionable advice. Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time.
Happy homeschooling!